All right, it is 10 after the hour, so we're going to get started. Wonderful to see such a great turnout for what I know will be an amazing talk. I am William Paris, the project director for the Race Ethics and Power Project. I'm also an assistant professor in the philosophy department. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Zahi Zalloua from Whitman College to give his talk, Fanon, contra Levinas, on Palestine and the politics of the faceless. Professor Zalloua is the Cushing Eels Professor of Philosophy and Literature and Director of Indigeneity, Race, and Ethnicity Studies at Whitman College, and he's also the editor of The Comparatists and many, many works and publications. Feel free to look them up. But with that, I will hand it over to you. Please welcome Professor Zalloua.
Thank you, William, for your very generous presentation. And it's very intimate space here, rare these days. So I'll try to speak loudly enough for folks in the back to hear me. Facelessness marks the racialized other in all its exposure and vulnerability. To be faceless already gestures to an ontological and symbolic violation, evoking a naked alterity thrust into what Fanon names the zone of non-being. Facelessness is arguably synonymous with state of abjection. Your very humanity becomes a contested matter. In my time today, I would like to take up the challenges in thinking facelessness ethically and politically, attending to the frictions between these two registers. My reflections are structured in three parts. First, I briefly discuss Emmanuel Levinas's ethics and what it might entail for an anti-racist politics. I then explore the ethics and politics of the faceless through a critical rereading of Levinas's notorious interview after the 1982 massacres of hundreds in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. Levinas's quick dismissal of his interlocutor question, isn't the Palestinian the other of the Israeli, functions unwittingly as a meta-commentary on the precarity of the naked human face, the coloniality of the face, and the limits of a Levinasian ethics. What can an ethics infatuated with the irreducible other tell us about the colonial situation, about Gaza, about the Palestinian other, or the victim of the victim? Finally, I consider the ontological and political ramifications of thinking Palestinians and the human itself without a face. My wager is that we must pursue a Fanonian politics of the faceless, where facelessness or wretchedness is not so much a condition to overcome, but a relation to reorient away from the mystifying lure of the dyadic ethics, the face-to-face Levinasian encounter, towards an emancipatory politics of humans and beyond, a void opened up by the paradoxical figure of the real neighbor, understood in its Lacanian sense. So here, the real neighbor is contrasted with the imaginary symbolic neighbor that resembles you, with whom you can actually communicate. So the real is a limitation of comprehension. What might emerge from this encounter with the faceless is potentially a questioning of my own being as such, and the ends to which my affective disposition and hopes have been turned. How does the affect of the faceless other impact my being? Can my social coordinates be altered in any way? That would be the ontological question. If so, what forms should this transformation take? And this would be the political question. So our first part. To think the other is to consider any marginalized figure, any excluded other. Levinas offers his own examples, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, and the Jew. But more generally, we could say that the other as other is anyone who resists my identification and domestication. In totality and infinity, the face, right, le visage of the other, it, quote, exceeds the idea of the other in me, end quote. This moment of cognitive frustration, which brings into question my autonomy, spontaneity, and self-sufficiency, is what Levinas describes famously as ethics. Affirming the priority of ethics over ontology, Levinas effectively dethrones the authority of reason and the Kantian ideal of autonomy as rational freedom, in favor of an enduring state of vulnerability and heteronomy, where freedom is demoted and made to occupy a secondary role to compassion. In Otherwise Than Being, Levinas asserts, quote, to be exposed to sickness, suffering, death is to be exposed to compassion, end quote. As Judith Butler notes, the Levinasian face does not designate, quote, the literal face, end quote. Instead, we should understand it as, quote, a demand that is exercised by the other not to kill, end quote. George Yancey extrapolates and translates the experience of negrophobia into a Levinasian register. As I move along urban streets, the white imaginary projects upon me, upon my black body, all of its fears, rendering my black body the instantiation of evil. In Levinasian terms, my face does not appear in the form of the imperative, thou shalt not murder. Blackness or blackened face indexes criminality rather than vulnerability. In white civil society, the face of the black subject does not operate in the same way as a human face ought to. The face of the black other misfires. An anti-black libidinal economy underpins the other's world, regulates her desires and fears. Who is afforded the privileges of the face is an effect of power or political ontology. It is intrinsically linked to a racial matrix that divides between faces, elevating white faces while denigrating blackened faces. Racialization constitutes a powerful social and political mechanism by which some beings are excluded from the category of the human as it is conceptualized and imagined in the West. Those who are deemed not quite human, non-human, are surveilled, terrorized, abandoned, denied love, or simply rendered superfluous. They are objects among other objects. As with Yancey's comment, however, the Levinasian register is evoked only to underscore its inadequacy in addressing the non-face of the racialized other, because that face never conveys the prohibition against murder, does not trigger a sense of infinite responsibility for those born faceless. The blackened other, the other who's rendered faceless, appears always already defaced, a face minus its ethical command, which is no face at all. Can one evoke a Levinasian framework without inferring the limits of its discourse in racial matters? Levinas works as long as you limit your discussion to white folks. Levinas is great with white people. Can it intervene and return the face to the racialized other? Is Levinasian ethics an adequate response to the abjection of the racialized other, an apt and generative resource for thinking otherwise? I propose to answer these questions by returning to the controversial radio interview that Levinas, along with Ella Finkelkraut, gave to Shlomo Malka shortly after the 1982 massacre of hundreds of Palestinians at the Sabra Shatila refugee camps in West Beirut, Lebanon, at the hands of Lebanese Christian Falangist militia in Israeli-occupied Lebanon. I would like to take up an anti-colonial politics of the faceless and pursue the avenues that Levinas himself willfully and carelessly foreclosed. As I see it, the interview is more than an embarrassment for Levinas and Levinasian ethics. It was a missed opportunity for philosophy to address the Palestinian question. And here I juxtapose the Levinas interview with the 2023 open letter, Philosophy for Palestine, signed by philosophy professors in North America, Latin America, and Europe who expressed their solidarity with the Palestinian people in the face of the genocidal campaign launched by Israel after October 7th, the Hamas attack in southern Israel. The statement indexes philosophy's ongoing efforts to reckon with its racial past. We do not claim any unique authority, moral, intellectual, or otherwise, on the basis of our being philosophers. However, our discipline has made admirable strides recently in confronting philosophy's historically exclusionary practices and in engaging directly with pressing and urgent injustices. To this end, we call on our colleagues in philosophy to join us in overcoming complicity and silence. The Levinas interview, read in its historical context or retroactively in light of philosophy's self-critique, tells us something about the limits of the face when confronted with a faceless non-European enemy. And a bit more theoretically, identification and misidentification of the face stages the incomprehensibility and cross-contamination of ethics and politics with notions of justice, sovereignty, and neighborly love straddling the two. It is almost impossible not to reread the interview in light of the carnage in Gaza and the West Bank. Palestinian objection and Israel's unconscionable role in its production was an ethical political concern then, as it is now. Malka starts the interview with the observation that the events at Sabra and Shatila have shaken the Jewish communities throughout the world, beginning with Israel's society itself. And given Levinas' standing as a philosopher who has harnessed the ethical force of Judaism, Levinas seems the ideal philosopher to comment on the grave situation. Levinas' highly meditative answer about Israel's innocence and responsibility vis-a-vis the massacres compels Malka to formulate the question in more concrete, if not naive terms. Emmanuel Levinas, you are the philosopher of the other. Isn't history, isn't politics the very site of the encounter with the other? And for the Israeli, isn't the other above all Palestinian? Great question, clear. Now, Levinas' answer. Levinas' sharp response takes the form of a correction, a philosophical lesson in phenomenology. My definition of the other is completely different. The other is the neighbor, right, mon prochain, who is not necessarily my kin, mon proche, but who may be. But if your neighbor attacks another neighbor or treats him unjustly, what can you do? Then alterity takes on another character. In alterity, we can find an enemy, or at least we're faced with the problem with knowing who's right and who's wrong, who's just, who's unjust. There are people who are wrong. Levinas rejects Malka's elevation of the Palestinian as Israel's radical other, right? The other outside the Zionist order of things. At one level, Levinas' response is consistent with his philosophical orientation. The other's face is irreducible to its ontological elements. It transcends cultural markers and physical features. Still, there is something deeply unsatisfying about the Levinasian model. It displays a philosophical failure to think and engage with the Palestinian other. To Enrique Dussel's objection that Levinas, quote, has never thought that the other could be an Indian, an African, an Asian, end quote, we can add a Palestinian. Levinas has no desire to transcend Europe and conceive of the other otherwise. And here, I'm intentionally evoking Levinas' second major work, Autrement qu'être, otherwise than being. Levinas' text is not open to those who inhabit the Fanonian zone of non-being, right? And inhabiting that zone takes on a kind of quasi-permanent character. There is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an incline stripped bare of every essential from which a genuine new departure can emerge. In most cases, a Black man cannot take advantage of this descent into a veritable hell. Not unlike Black being, the being of the Palestinian is subjugated to an annihilating ontological zone that is experienced as an unending condition. The Palestinian is neither the abstract European human nor the neighbor kin, the Jewish other. But he is arguably infinitely foreign to the Israeli. Levinas forecloses this line of inquiry. Indeed, as he says elsewhere, the best way to encounter the other is not even to notice the color of his eyes. Well, you have a beautiful ethics of alterity there. Philosophy is not sociology. It's not critical race theory or post-colonial theory. Alterity is not an effect of cultural discourse whose meaning is relationally and historically determined. Likewise, processes of of racialization do not or cannot factor into Levinas's reading of Palestinians. Philosophically speaking, Palestinians do not hold any special status for Israelis. They are no different from Jordanians, Koreans, or Swedes. A neighbor could be kin, but not necessarily. When neighbors are at war, a decision must be made. And here we pass from ethics to politics in Levinas, from the dyadic relationship with the self and the other to the third, when you have to negotiate between two demands, at least two demands. Whenever you find yourself in front of more than one neighbor, you have to decide. Levinas acknowledges the complication that the third introduces in the face-to-face relation. There is an incommensurability that exists between ethics and politics. But as the title of one of Levinas's essay makes clear, I'll put this as an isolated slide, politics after. Ethics takes priority over politics. Ethics first indexes the subordination of politics to ethics to what transcends the political order, as Jacques Derrida puts it in Adieu. Levinas ends the interview on a seemingly pertinent note, expressing the primacy of the other over the land, claiming that, quote, a person is more holy than a land, even a holy land. Really? Isn't this too little too late? Is a Palestinian more holy than the idea or ideal of Israel? What is the rhetorical effect of stating that a person is more holy than a land when the Palestinian neighbor has already been defaced, her alterity determined as an enemy of the Jewish people? Isn't Levinas exempting Israelis from confronting their historical and ongoing mistreatment of Palestinians? The faceless Palestinian never prompts Levinas and the majority of Israeli Jews to reckon with their colonial regime, with the fact of Zionism. Judith Butler takes Levinas to task for neglecting to extend the primacy of the face to Palestinians. In the domain of politics, Butler imagines a more rigorous Levinasian rethinking of the enemy's face that could open up onto an ethics of the Palestinian, especially when that face is politically demonized and dehumanized and thus rendered void.
Ooh.
For Levinas, the prohibition against violence is restricted to those whose faces make a demand upon me. And yet, these faces are differentiated by virtue of their religious and cultural background. This then opens up the question of whether there is any obligation to preserve the life of those who appear faceless within his view, or perhaps to extend this logic by virtue of not having a face, do not appear at all. We have not yet seen a study of the faceless in Levinas. While I can sympathize with Butler's project to read Levinas otherwise, a Levinas against Levinas, as it were, a position that I myself have taken up in the past, I have become more skeptical of Levinas's ethics, of a Levinasian ethics, of the desire or project to formulate what a genuine encounter between Levinas and the Palestinian other might look like. So I'm not proposing a study of the faceless in Levinas. Rather, I want to consider the faceless in relation to Palestinian objection and ask if the effort to invest in the face, in an ever more expanding, inclusive idea of the face, is not part and parcel of the problem. So here the idea is not to increase who can count as human under the umbrella of the human, but to see that logic as problematic itself. Leaving the climate of Levinas's thinking is a precondition for thinking the relationship between ethics and politics differently. Confronted with the Palestinian question, Levinas's evasive strategy enrages. What happens when seeing the face of one's kin is premised on defacing the neighbor's face, when privileging the state of Israel is premised on disprivileging the Palestinian people? Levinas sees the vulnerability of his fellow Israeli Jews, but not that of his Palestinian foes. He is responsive to the demands of his kin, but cruelly indifferent to the call of Palestinians. The face of the Palestinians never registers as a supplication of the weak to the mighty. the Palestinian stands for the reducible other, right, versus the irreducible other that grounds Levinasian ethics. At no time does Levinas ponder the responsibility of Israel, Jews, and the Zionist movement for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, for pushing the indigenous inhabitants of the land into Lebanon and other neighboring Arab nations. Why do Sabra and Shatila refugee camps exist in the first place? Is a question that Levinas never entertains. And this is not a mere oversight, but speaks of a reckless indifference, right, to use the language of the letter of Philosophy for Palestine, to the history of the Palestinians that Levinas' Zionism only amplifies. Palestinians are living a future created by the Nakba, right, the Arabic word for catastrophe, right, which designates 1948. All Palestinian existence is informed, if not structured, by the Nakba. But the idea of an ongoing Nakba never preoccupies Levinas. The catastrophe suffered by Palestinians does not register for Levinas because, in Zionist fashion, he casts doubt about the existence of Palestinians as a people. In the neighbor's alterity, one can find an enemy or a friend, tells us Levinas. Does your kin, fellow Jew, take precedence over the Arab neighbor? In principle, it shouldn't, but in practice, it did and does. For Levinas, the Palestinian other is not an autrui, right, the ethical designation, the ethical other. Or rather, he's not treated as such. It is also telling that Levinas is less convinced of, it is also telling that Levinas is less than convinced about Palestinian identity, Palestinian indigeneity, as he puts it in the very essay, Politics After. The origins of the conflict between Jews and Arabs go back to Zionism. That's correct. This conflict has been acute since the creation of the State of Israel on a small piece of arid land, which had belonged to the children of Israel for more than 30 centuries before, and which has never been abandoned by the Jewish communities. During the diaspora, they continued to lay claim to it, and since the beginning of the century, their labors have made it flower again. But it also happens to be a small piece of land which has been inhabited by people who are surrounded by all sides and by vast stretches of land containing the great Arab people of which they form a part. They call themselves Palestinians. So Levinas here repeats ideological Zionist tropes, metaphysical indigeneity, and how the State of Israel made the desert bloom. So when Levinas is faced with a problem of knowing who's right and who's wrong, who's just and who's unjust, it matters a great deal that he imagines Palestinians, but as they call themselves, as part of the great Arab hordes encircling the precarious State of Israel and its biblically sanctioned inhabitants. Now turning to the last section. Slavoj Žižek helps us cut through Levinas's double talk. So my Fanon gets a little supplement from Žižek here. Žižek cuts through Levinas's double talk about ethics of alterity and infinite responsibility. He writes, what Levinas is basically saying is that as a principle, respect for alterity is unconditional, the highest sort of respect, but when faced with a concrete other, one should nonetheless see if he's a friend or enemy. In short, in practical politics, the respect for alterity, strictly speaking, means nothing. The face falters at the political level. Whereas Levinas tips the political scales in favor of his Jewish neighbor, falling back on a rather traditional autonomous and sovereign subject, right, the person who decides the friend and the enemy, blocking in turn the demands of the Palestinian other, Žižek insists that the true ethical step is the one beyond the face of the other, the one of suspending the whole of the face, the one of choosing against the face for the third. Levinas's kin neighbor possesses an imaginary symbolic face, while Žižek's faceless neighbors do not, and that's the point. Justice must be blind and not favor a particular face over another face. So Zizek's long essay on neighbors, he contrasts, he juxtaposes Levinas's the importance of the face, this radical alterity of the other, with Primo Levi's Musulman, right? The most abject Jew in Auschwitz, right? Where the face cannot be deciphered when you see the Musulman. So the Musulman occupies the position of the real neighbor. And this is a person, since we have to entertain when dealing with politics, because the face is always a lure, right? It compels you to act because you recognize yourself in the face. So for Zizek, and I think for Fanon, there has to be a shift away from anything human as a source of my attraction for them. Zizek's real neighbors, or faceless thirds, are, in my opinion, Fanon's wretched of the earth. The non-Europeans who are politically unsettling and contesting the liberal unconscious and its humanist grammar of suffering. If the Jew is a paradigmatic suffering subject, what happens to the dispossessed Palestinian? If Israel can be only seen through the Shoah, what happens to the native inhabitants of historic Palestine? Levinas's elevation of the Shoah cannot be separated from his and Europe's devaluation of colonialism and anti-Blackness. In Discourse on Colonialism, Aimé Césaire, Fanon's teacher in Martinique, offers an anti-colonial rebuke to the Western outrage over the Holocaust, exposing the subject of the outrage as the moral bourgeois subject. What the moral bourgeois subject cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. The West only cares about its own imaginary symbolic neighbors. Hitler betrayed his own. Not holding back, Césaire's anti-colonial intervention indicts Europeans and their inner Hitlers. The moral bourgeois subject, quote, has a Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, end quote. Europeans were beneficiaries of Hitlerian abroad colonialism, but Hitlerism at home was an aberration and was deemed unacceptable. Césaire's mode of address finds a receptive ear in Fanon, who is stupefied by Europe's murderous track records. When I look for man in European lifestyles and technology, I see a constant denial of man, an avalanche of murders. This passage from Fanon echoes Benjamin's famous observation that every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism. Every iteration of the human face is also an iteration of its defacement. To elevate my face, I must destroy yours. Recalling hearing a political speech by Césaire, Fanon quotes him from memory. When I switch on my radio, people listening to radios back then, when I switch on my radio and hear the black men are being lynched in America, I say they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. When I switch on my radio and hear that Jews are being insulted, persecuted, massacred, I say they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. And finally, when I switch on my radio and hear that in Africa, forced labor has been introduced and legalized, I say that truly they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. When I flip the channel and hear that undocumented children are being targeted in their schools by Trump immigration raids, I say they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. When I flip the channel and see that refugees are drowning or denied asylum as they flee the country, I say they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. When I flip the channel and see that blacks are being humiliated, harassed, and murdered by the US police, I say they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. And finally, when I flip the channel and see that Gazans are being starved and bombed in hospitals, I say they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. We're living in the afterlife of Hitler and fascism's rebirth. A Hitler, as the embodiment of a cruel colonialism, stands for more than the horrors of biological racism. Hitler symbolizes a fascist racial matrix that generates beings who matter, beings who matter a bit, and non-beings who are genocidable. Following Césaire and Fanon, colonialism and anti-Blackness need a hearing in the West. Denazification must pass through decolonization or an anti-colonial critique. This approach to an expansive colonialism returns us to Europe's earlier crimes in order to better understand their lingering and crushing presence in our global lives today. Born translated, stripped of symbolic worth, deemed a problem from the start, indigenous alterity is met with settler hostility. An orientalized image of the Palestinians sets in. There is no ethics with or of the native in the colonizer's Manichaean world. If, as Fanon observed, in Europe, evil is symbolized by the black man, end quote, in Israel, evil is symbolized by the Palestinian. Those deemed absolute evil and the enemy of values are then cast aside, shoved into the zone of non-being. Colonial structures are applied and enforced. An ontological partition is erected and preserved, separating the humans from the barbarians, the civilized from the human animals. While the settler dreams of enjoying the plenitude of his being, Césaire and Fanon reminds us that settler colonialism decivilizes the settler as well. Here, the referential range of settler is not limited to those who live in the occupied territories, or to those who live in illegal settlements or outposts. There is an inner settler in all Israelis. For under a Zionist horizon, settlers are interpolated in the disfiguration of Palestinians, in the making of Palestinians as faceless human animals. Levinasian ethics is ill-equipped to counter Zionism's zoological reason. To be sure, we can say that zoological reason reduces the Palestinian to an economy of the same that fails to bear witness to the radical alterity of the indigenous other. Animalizing other is often the first step in defacing the other, the enemy. At best, Levinasian ethics can offer a sentimentalist orientation towards the other. The other becomes subjugated to the challenges of empathy. The face is retrievable in the good Palestinian, the innocent Palestinian, which is basically the dead Palestinian. Mm-hmm. At worst, Palestinians faceless, at least at worst, Palestinian facelessness get stuck in a depoliticized ethical loop. Are Palestinians human, not quite human, non-human? Levinas may speak of the imperialism of the same, right? And here he's drawing on a register, the kind of totalitarian register, authoritarian logic that underpins ontology, while vaguely hinting at Europeans' own history with tyranny. But it is not the imperialism of a philosophical approach that disavows the colonial situation and its own carceral logic that proves to be more damaging and violent for Palestinians. So here's not the reduction of ethics to epistemology or ontology. It's the politics of Europe that is the biggest obstacle. So Fanon, as a different modality than Levinas, allows us to understand the lived experience of Zionism, that the Palestinian-Israeli dyad is fundamentally a racial relation, a relation involving two different species, two types of neighbors, where no ethical relation is in fact possible. The settler wants ontocide, right? The destruction, the killing of the other's being, the elimination of the native's being. The native wants to de-Zionize the settler and usher in a colonization of the land, of the mind. Exiting the zone of non-being must involve a global reckoning with settler colonialism, with a Zionist reality to which Levinasian ethics, strictly speaking, remains silent to.